let's turn the page now and concentrate on where we left last time. But before I resume, do you have questions? Normally you should. Yes, Christine.
You said for the Jewish reaction, we need to know the different reaction for each country. You just want us to know like the overall reactions?
The part 3 of Davidovich is not only, it's not typically a reaction, it's just statistics. That is, how many casualties, how many dead, how many died as a consequence of the final solution. You have a look on it, but it's just informative, but I will not question you. I will not ask you how many German Jews died, how many Luxembourgish, how many, no. I mean the Jewish reaction, that is in part 2. How did the Jewish communities and the Jews on an individual basis, how did they feel when the Nazis started this, the implementation of the anti-Semitic policy in Germany first, and then afterwards, as when Germany had annexed Austria, then in Austria afterwards, and then of course once they had annexed Czechoslovakia, practically Bohemia, that is the present-day Czech Republic, and then ultimately also once the war was on, but of course that was. Then the Jewish communities did not have a big choice any longer. Then they were caught. They were caught in an environment which was controlled by the Germans. That's what I meant, that you should look it over to see how did the Jewish community react. Let's put it, you have to concentrate on certain dates when Hitler came to power. There was already a reaction at that time, because some of them left right away. Then, how did they react when Hitler started, when the Nazis started the anti-Jewish, let's say, boycott measures and the harassment of Jewish businesses and so on? And then afterwards, how did they react when the anti-Semitic, when the so-called Nuremberg racialist legislation was published in 1935? And then again, how did they react after the Reichskristallnacht? That is November 9th to the 10th, 1938. And then, of course, afterwards, of course, there was not much left at that time. Once the war was on, they were caught, and the possibilities to get away were very limited. But until Hitler started his attack in the West against France, and from that moment on, when the French went down for defeat, there was no way to escape from that moment on, because the Germans controlled practically everything, either directly or all the territories, or they controlled it through, let's say, through the pressure they were able to exert on this, let's say, sympathetic governments which existed in France and in other places after 1940. Do you have other questions? Yes?
What's the significance of Marshal Zhukov, like in comparison to like the US generals?
I think that he was an excellent general in strategic terms. The Russians have produced over the past, and I could give you examples of outstanding Russian generals as far back as the wars against Napoleon. Zhukov was an excellent general, but he belongs to this kind, I mean, he belongs to the Russian tradition of commanders, whether this did take place in communist days or before communist days. The Russian generals were never particularly tender with their own troops. They did not hesitate to sacrifice troops for them, and this is a Russian tradition, and not only a tradition among the generals, but also among the Russian statesmen, the political responsibles. Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Stalin, Lenin. They did not hesitate a single moment to sacrifice hundreds of thousands, even sometimes millions of their own citizens, of their own subjects, for the sake of their power, for the sake of reinforcing government power, state power. So in that regard, Zhukov, like all the other Russian generals, whether this would, there were others. The Russians had also other great generals. For instance, Konev. Konev was the one who he later on became a rival to Zhukov in the days of Stalin and after the war. Rokossovsky. Rokossovsky was a general of Polish background, or Malinovsky and Chuikov, and they had a long list of remarkable generals. They had also a certain number of non-entities. For instance, those, I did not give you the names, but I can do it now. Those who were responsible for the tremendous losses and prisoners the Germans made at the beginning. These were generals like Bujony or Timoshenko. Timoshenko and Bujony, they were Stalin's buddies from party, from their past, where they had sided with Stalin when Stalin came to power. But on the front line, they were non-entities, mediocrities. Now, how would I compare Zhukov now in comparison to American generals? He was on the Russian side what you have had outstanding military commanders. The one which I found, I mean, General Marshall, he was exceptional in being on top and overseeing all of this. And he was exceptional not only in organizing the war effort, but also even after the war. After all, the Marshall Plan, it is not a hazard that he was the one who gave his name to this to this plan for economic recovery. But on the terrain, you have had, I think, 3 outstanding commanders. One was MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, he was exceptional, I mean, in the war against Japan, but he was not the only one. It was also Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz is the one who commanded during the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. And MacArthur is the one, combined with Nimitz, even though there were rivalries between the two, of who, you know, military commanders also are human beings, and they are jealous, and there is an element of vanity which is always inherent in this. Now, on the European stage, there is no doubt that Patton was the outstanding military commander. But Patton would have been the same as MacArthur. In political terms, generals are very often disasters because they only see the military, strategic or tactical aspect of handling a war problem. That is why MacArthur he went too far later on during the Korean War. Even though at the beginning he was still an excellent commander. But to give you one example, when MacArthur refused, afterwards it was hard to believe. When Truman wanted to meet him, your president at the time, and MacArthur said, well, then come halfway. Instead of ordering MacArthur to come to Washington to talk to him, Truman went to the Pacific, I think to the island of Wake, to meet MacArthur, who had his headquarters in Tokyo. So in that regard, MacArthur just went beyond what was reasonable. And also when he started threatening to use an A-bomb or the A-bomb against China. Patton was an excellent commander. I think it was your best commander during on the European stage from 1943 on, when he had landed, or even from late 1942 on, from the landing of Morocco to his death. But on the other hand, he was also provocative, and therefore Eisenhower had a rough time with him when he at a given moment told the Soviet general, I do not know whether you should watch, if you have the possibility, the movie which was made on him, Patton. It is an excellent movie. When he met with the Russian commander, I forgot who it was not Zhukov, I think it was Konjev. then he called him at a given moment with a big grin on his face, "You communist bastard." He addressed him. But of course, that is not exactly the way you are supposed to deal with an ally, even though I could understand that he had a very poor opinion on communism. But it was shocking, and he got away with it. So in other words, there was a little polish and there was a little, let's say, lifestyle which he lacked. But he was an outstanding military commander, and he also knew his history. When he fought the Germans in Tunisia, I remember this scene of the movie. He, before they captured a 250,000 German soldiers in Tunisia, Patton stood there, at least it is recorded in the movie, and he remembered the Battle of Zama. The Battle of Zama was a battle between Scipio, the African, and Hannibal. How the Roman general forced the Carthaginian general to surrender. So in other words, he knew he was exceptional. But, and on the British side it was Montgomery. Even Montgomery had, of course, vanity for 10 more generals. Patton, by the way, also. But anyway, Montgomery was also a good general. But I know only of one general who was, well, there are 3 outstanding examples in history where military commanders were also exceptional intellectuals and I would say superior examples of mankind. And one was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was not only an outstanding general, he was also an exceptional statesman, and he was a great writer. His book on the conquest of Gaul and his book on the Civil War became a classic in his days and afterwards. Even Julius Caesar is, with Cicero, quoted as one of the great classics. The other one, who also was a great writer, was Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was probably not that great of a general because he stood out as a political figure. In 1940, when the French lost the war, and after 1958, when he came back to power. But his memoirs, de Gaulle's memoirs, are a piece of literature, of outstanding French literature. And when he spoke on the TV, and I can tell you, it was the time when I studied in Paris, and when he had his little so-called superficial anti-American fling, he spoke so well, without notes. He had notes, but he never looked on his notes. And I could particularly compare him to Richard Nixon. When Nixon was not that bad of a president, but he was a poor speaker. De Gaulle, when he spoke freely for 15 minutes, and what he said could be printed right away. So in that sense, de Gaulle was an exceptional general. Zhukov was comparable to MacArthur and Patton together. He was the great general on the Soviet side who was responsible because he had a free hand. Stalin let him do it. He was the one who won the Battle of Moscow in December 1941. He's the one who won the Battle of Stalingrad in September 42, January 43, and he's the one who won the Battle of Kursk in July, August 1943. So in that regard, Zhukov was top, absolutely. Are there other questions? So in other words, I can be reassured that you know all of it. There are no problems. Everything is crystal clear. So does that mean, because you're not asking me, I will get mean now, that as you do not ask me questions, so I can I can, let's say, push a little bit the degree of difficulties of my questions because you know everything so well? Or does that all of a sudden inspire you to ask me questions?
As I was reading over Davidovich, kind of unclear as to what exactly happened between the SA and the SS.
The SA, they were, Hitler had, let's say, two paramilitary organizations. The one which played a decisive role in 1923 in the failed putsch was the SA. The SS was barely existent. It was they were his bodyguard. The one which played first an important role in 1932 till 1933 was again the SA, because they were the rowdies, the hooligans who terrorized normal citizens in the street and who intimidated them and prepared psychologically Hitler's rise to power. But then, once he was in power, the chief of staff of the SA, it was not the head. Hitler was nominally still the head of the SA. But in reality, the chief of staff, Ernst Röhm, was the one who really had control over the SA. He became a liability, and we have, I think we have mentioned that, so that ultimately, as he became a threat in many ways, he personally to Hitler, he became a threat to the generals, he became a threat to the Nazi and non-Nazi establishment, as he spoke about a second revolution. So Hitler decided to do away with him and with the leadership. And that was when he organized the Night of the Long Knives. And those who carried out this coup against the SA were Göring, the Gestapo, and the SS, Himmler's SS. They were the ones who arrested the leadership, and not only the SA leadership, and killed them, but also others. And from that moment on, the SA went into a phase of decline. They did not play an important role anymore. On the contrary, this was the beginning of the rise of the SS, who became the key instrument for Hitler's control over Germany and also for carrying out the final solution. And in addition, even contributing to the military effort Hitler was forced to resort to in the conquest of living space. The SS became supreme. The SA reappeared one more time, but only briefly, and that was during the Reichskristallnacht. Goebbels had mobilized the SA on November 9th to the 10th in order to go out chasing, breaking the glass, burning the synagogues, Jewish businesses, killing Jewish people, and so on. This was the last time that the SA reappeared in all their brutality and in all their primitive violence. And from that moment on, the SA were practically out of the question. And the SS became more and more and more important.
Did members of the SA ever switch from the SA to the SS?
Well, let's say the SA, they remained a reality, but they were not a power reality any longer. They had grown in their early days. They had grown when Hitler came to power. They had become, by 1933, January, nearly 1 million. But then, when Hitler ultimately turned against them, when they had become a threat to him, they had grown to 4 million. But then came the Night of the Long Knives, when the leadership was assassinated. They dropped again, and nobody was interested in joining a group which was out of favor and which was not playing a role any longer. On the contrary, the opportunists, they were now interested in the SS, in order to join the SS, because it was in the SS where you could make a career. If you really felt that you needed a career inside the Nazi institutions. Other questions? Yes?
In Vest, I was sort of confused about the personality of Frank. Was his main role as Governor General of Poland, or more as like a lawyer for the Nazi Party, or were they equally?
He was a lawyer for the Nazi Party before the war broke out. He's the one, for instance, whom Hitler requested to investigate his background, whether he had Jewish, blood in his veins. And Frank, of course, found out that that was not the case. But he was not the only lawyer. Frick, the Minister of the Interior, who came in charge of the police, and who also was the one who invented the so-called Nuremberg racialist laws. Frick was also a lawyer. But Frank's role was, as a lawyer, he was one of the key Hitler advisors. But once now the war was on, and once Germany occupied Poland, then practically he switched completely to his job as Governor General of Poland. And the Nazis made even jokes about his name. They would call the general government of Poland Frankreich. Frankreich, the same name as France. But this was, of course, a play on the name of Frank, the country of Frank. He became then the Nazi representative in charge of it. But again, he was not now the only important Nazi in charge of what was going on in Poland. Besides him, Himmler was extremely important. Himmler, as head of the SS, Himmler was in charge of the ghettos. Himmler became in charge of the concentration and extermination camps. And in addition, there was Rosenberg, who came in charge of the occupied Eastern territories. And there were even other minor Gauleiters. It was, as the Nazis operated usually, it was a kind of many, let's say, leaders who rivaled amongst themselves in their obedience and in their, I would say, in their dedication to comply to what Hitler expected them to do. But he was, from September 1939 on, essentially the general governor of Poland, residing in Krakow in the Wawel castle. And later on, when he was arrested, he also was condemned to death and hanged. Before his execution, in the few days between the death condemnation and his execution, he sat down and wrote I do not say memoir, his memoirs, but it was In the Side of the Gallows. That was the title of what he wrote down the days before his execution. Frank.
I read about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and it said that towards the end that the ZOB wouldn't hand over the rest of the Jewish workers. How many were there left that the Nazis were going to take out of the ghetto?
You mean when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising broke down?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you must keep in mind, and I might come back to today or on Friday, the Warsaw Ghetto, when it was filled, when it was practically built up, there were nearly 500,000 Jewish people parked in this ghetto. But then the order came out to empty the ghettos, to empty all the ghettos. And from that moment on, in a systematic way, the Judenrat, that is the Nazi established official Jewish representation, they had to single out those who would go on transport. In other words, those who would be taken out to be sent to the extermination camps. Essentially, the Warsaw Ghetto had, as the closest extermination camp was Treblinka. So they took out, of course, children, elderly people, sick people, women, so that ultimately, when the ghetto uprising occurred, from this 500,000, there were, we do not know exactly how many, maximum 50,000, maybe only 30,000 were left. But these 30,000 were younger people. They had been preserved from being sent on transport because the Nazis used them to work for their war industry. So they were the ones who organized the uprising, the 30,000. And out of these 30,000, the ZOB, that is their fighting organization, they had maybe altogether something like 1,000 or 1,200. And of course they fought with minimal equipment. With you remember how they got their guns and how they smuggled and they had, but they fought then from April, was it 16th or it was mid-April until early May. That is a little bit more than 3 weeks. Sometimes if you add to this first attempt at resistance, this Warsaw Ghetto uprising amounted to limited, particularly at the end, of course, there was heavy fighting for about 6 weeks, but the period of the toughest fighting were about 3 weeks, from mid-April till the first week of May. Nearly all of those who fought were killed. The survivors, there were two categories of survivors. Some of the survivors escaped through the sewers towards the outside. The Germans could not catch them. They got outside and joined the underground, the Polish underground. The others who remained in the headquarters, there were only few, we do not know how many, maybe 10, maybe 20, they committed suicide. They killed one another. They did not want to fall into German hands. And this was like a reminder of the suicide which the Jewish rebels committed in the days of the Emperor Hadrian, where the last Jewish survivors in this uprising against the Romans had also committed suicide, not to fall into enemy hands. So that was the end of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Again, do not make the confusion between that event and the Warsaw uprising. The Warsaw uprising was an uprising of the Polish underground army. They were about altogether 15,000. And this Warsaw uprising lasted from mid-August till end of September, early October. And that was crushed by the German SS units. And among these SS units, there were two categories. They were so, let's say, psychopaths and criminals. One of the brigades was a death head unit from the extermination camps, and the other unit was a unit of criminals. They liberated criminals on the condition that they were willing to crush the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And there was even one SS commander, von dem Bach-Zelewski is his name. He was an ill-reputed SS commander. He was so shocked, and even a higher SS officer is shocked over the amount of crimes which were committed by this unit, that he even ordered the execution of some of these SS brigades, because they just went beyond acceptance even on the side of the SS. That was the Warsaw uprising. After that, Warsaw was a dead city. 80% of the city was destroyed, or 90% was destroyed. That is a big difference with Krakow. Krakow escaped this fate. I do remember one thing personally. I once attended a seminar in Warsaw about underground and resistance during Nazi occupation. And then I learned that at the end of the Warsaw uprising, none of the more than 300 Baroque churches, every quarter in Warsaw had a church. And a Baroque church, you know that the Baroque style is a style which is very decorative and which we have visited when we were in Krakow, some of the Baroque churches. They are beautiful churches. There were 350. And so you would have expected that they would have rebuilt half a dozen or 10, the most beautiful, in order to have those churches. The Poles rebuilt them all, the 350, all rebuilt exactly how they were. Okay, now, are there other questions? Yes?
I'm wondering how the sort of concentration SS and the Einsatzgruppen chose their soldiers.
Himmler picked them, and if Himmler did not pick them, then Heydrich or there were a number of higher SS. They picked them because they were known for their cruelty, for their primitiveness, for their criminality. They would, of course, not call those qualifications. They would consider them for their toughness. That is, for the ruthlessness with which they dealt with prisoners, they dealt with those who were under their command in the concentration camps. And but here, to crush the Warsaw up, they picked, of course, the worst, because the extermination camps, well, the concentration camps were emptied, and some of the extermination camps were also, remember the Warsaw Uprising, that's October 1944. By that time, most of the extermination camps had been destroyed, because once the Russians moved in, because they were located all in eastern and central Poland, the only one which was closer to the west, that was Auschwitz, which was to the southwest. The others, like Sobibor, Belzec, I think even Treblinka lay on the other side, Majdanek. Once the SS did withdraw, they would destroy them. And they could not destroy Auschwitz altogether because it was too big a camp. And it was not just extermination, it was also labor and concentration camp. But camps like Belzec, for instance, or Sobibor, to pick only those, or Kelmno, they were just limited, relatively small-sized death factories, where there were no provisions made to keep prisoners working in barracks for the war effort. The trains came in and emptied and immediately went to the gas chambers and to the crematoriums. So in other words, these were limited in terms of space, facilities, and the Germans had abandoned them. Those death head units which were in charge of those, they were, you could say, without a job because they had moved westwards. So they used them then to crush the Warsaw Uprising. There was no sophisticated selection, and you know, criminality and psychopathic behavior, you have easily discovered those who, and of course there were even volunteers who would be willing to fight to do this job. Okay, then let's turn now to back to the last summit meeting, which did take place in Potsdam, July, I think 17 till August 2nd, 3rd or 3rd. I already told you that it did take place in a Soviet-controlled area. Potsdam, which was the residence of the kings of Prussia, Frederick II, who had Sanssouci in Potsdam. So Stalin was the host, and he was the one who had been present also during the other summit meetings, that is in Tehran and in Yalta. Truman was new. He participated, and he was relatively shocked when he arrived, because he noticed how the Soviet occupation forces behaved with still great cruelty towards the civilians. And he heard stories, because we are, at that time, we are in July, August, that is, the war was over from May, barely 3 months. And Stalin had not yet stopped this kind of excesses against the civilian population, particularly against women. As I told you, that they had to endure the brutality of the Russian occupying forces. On the other hand, Churchill participated the first week, and then he left. He went back to London to be present during the elections. But once he was back, the British population, unlike what he had expected, did not express their, let's say, their recognition and their thanks for what he did during the war. Churchill was an eminent war leader. There's no doubt about it. He's the one who represented the British resilience and courage and determination. But he's also the one who had said that he would stick to the empire, that the British would practically reaffirm their imperial ambitions wherever they were, whether this was India, whether this was the Near East, whether this was Africa. And Churchill also had rejected any idea of social legislation or of far-going medical reforms, whereas the Labour opposition, who had as their leader Clement Attlee, the Labour opposition had made it clear that the British people had paid their due for the war effort, that they were now entitled to expect that their material situation would improve. And so Labour had clearly shown that they would withdraw from their imperial territories and that they would do something for their own people. And that is why Labour won the elections. Now you could say, well, how could Churchill be so blind? Well, that's a good question. On the other hand, there was a precedent, because after World War I, Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, the same as in France, the Prime Minister at that time was Clemenceau. The two nationalist leaders had organized elections. The war was over, you know, in November 11th, and immediately afterwards, early December, the French and the British organized elections, and the respective prime ministers won those elections, because they had made the electoral campaign on the theme, "We shall make them pay," the Germans. So they won. And so Churchill thought that if he would organize elections, even though it was in the middle of, and particularly as he was supposed to go back to Potsdam, that the British population could not disavow him, could not vote for his political opponent, because he was supposed to go back. He was one of the three big participants in the summit meetings. But he was wrong. He was defeated, and so Attlee came back. Now, Attlee was new, the same as Truman, and this was, of course, a weakness compared to Stalin. Stalin represented the continuity of the past summit meetings, and the others were freshmen, you could say. But they nonetheless, Attlee as well as Truman, they were surrounded by the political advisors of their predecessors. Truman had the same advisors who had already been close to Roosevelt, and Attlee had the same who had been close to Churchill. But nonetheless, it was a blow. So Stalin was in a position of strength. Now, what is the importance of Potsdam? Potsdam was the last summit meeting. The next summit meeting will take 10 years before it was organized. And this next summit meeting would take place in Geneva in 1955. So, of course, nobody knew that. Because in between these two summit meetings, there was the Cold War, there was the Korean War, there were major events in international relations which had antagonized the wartime allies of 1941, 1945. Now, what were then the decisions taken in Potsdam? Essentially, I do not want to overload your memory because they were not of that great importance. Potsdam practically reaffirmed or repeated the major decisions which had already taken place in Yalta. And when Potsdam occurred, at that time the United Nations existed already, because the San Francisco Conference, which was the birth conference which gave birth to the United Nations, had taken place in June. That is more than a month earlier. So that practically it was the repetition of those conditions which on the decisions which were made at an earlier date. Nonetheless, and the Russians had not yet entered the war. The Russians, I told you, had promised Roosevelt that they would enter the war in the Far East 3 months after the end of the war in the West. So they will attack Japan only August 8th. That is when the Potsdam Conference was already over. But Truman, and so in other words, the Russian impact, which of course was not comparable to what it might have been without the US A-bomb. The Russian impact was not yet taken place. They were still preparing to attack, but at a given moment, when the conference was well on its way, it lasted after all a little bit more than 2 weeks, Truman was told about the successful testing of the first American A-bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico. When this was mentioned, he at the same time, he had already, before leaving, he had already given the order, if that would be a successful test, and everybody expected it to be, that it should be used against Japan. So in other words, the preparations immediately afterwards continued to drop bombs on the two cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But, and this is now an important element, which was found out only later on. When Truman mentioned then, during the conference, to Stalin, we have an exceptional new weapon, a new bomb, which has an unexpected power. Stalin, the normal reaction would have been that he would have said, oh, tell us more about it. What is it? How did you do it? And Stalin had only a very short comment, oh, that's good. Nothing else. Why was he so short in his reaction? Well, for the good reason that he knew everything about it. Because the Russian spy net in the United States, as well as in England, because there was a sharing of the atomic secret between the two allies, the US and the British. And the Russians had their agents in these projects, in England as well as in the United States. The Russian spies were only discovered later on. But Stalin knew about it, and he was scared. Stalin was extremely concerned, and that is why he had put, once he was informed about what was going on, about the American Manhattan Project, he insisted on the Russian side that they should build their own bomb. And the same as on the US side, a number of high-ranking scientists were instrumental in practically, let's say, fabricating the bomb. It was Fermi and Einstein, they were, exiles from Europe who were theoretically preparing it. But on the US side, it was essentially Robert Oppenheimer, who is sometimes considered as the father of the American A-bomb. On the Russian side, it was Sakharov. It was the man who later on stood out as a political opponent to Brezhnev, and even to some degree even Gorbachev. So Stalin knew about it, and he put in charge of directing the Russian nuclear project to catch up with the United States. He put up the head of the Russian secret police, Beria. Laurentich Beria was put in charge of this project, and they invested all they could. And it took them, nonetheless, 4 years until September 1949, when they ultimately were able to have their first A-bomb explosion. So Stalin knew exactly what this meant, and it was already very clearly the proof that the Russians were spying out on their allies. This Russian espionage activity was only discovered on the American side much later. It was more than a year later, in late 1946, early 1947, that the United States found out that their so-called good friends and allies, the Russians, had their spies on their scientific projects. But this being said, Potsdam, nonetheless, the atmosphere during this last summit meeting was quite different than what it had been in Yalta or what it had been in Tehran. In Tehran and in Yalta, the atmosphere was relatively cordial, was relatively sympathetic, because Roosevelt trusted Stalin. Roosevelt, as this is very often the case when on the American side there's a great friendliness towards whoever is a partner. Roosevelt was on a direct personal basis with Stalin. It was not Mr. General Secretary, it was Joe for Joseph Stalin. Well, Roosevelt found out that Joe was not as good as he thought he was, and Truman was quite different. With Harry Truman, the atmosphere was businesslike. Truman basically distrusted Stalin and the Russian side, so that the atmosphere compared to the former summit meeting was chilly, and will, after Potsdam, will step by step deteriorate to the point that from friendly to businesslike to chilly, it became, with the months and years passing by, frankly hostile. But then, when it became openly hostile, then we are already in the year 1947, 2 years later. That was the beginning of the Cold War. Now,
what was Truman's reaction to Stalin's comment about, was he suspicious at all?
No. He just, he disregarded this. It was only later on, when others critically remembered this reaction, they considered that it was not a normal reaction. But even at that time, the United States were, as I said, had firmly decided to use the A-bomb. So just a couple of days after the end of Potsdam, the first A-bomb was dropped over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. That was August 6, 1945, with the devastating effect it had. The Japanese, of course, were unsuspecting, because there was only one big plane appearing on the sky, and it was this plane who dropped the bomb. 3 days later, I mean 2 days later, after August 6, the Red Army attacked on a massive scale. 500,000 Russian troops attacked the Japanese. The Soviet Union had a frontier with the Japanese territorial occupants. This frontier was in Korea, because Korea was annexed by Japan after 1910, and Russia has a common frontier with North Korea at the present time. Russia also had a common frontier with northeastern China, the territory which is called Manchuria, which had been occupied also. So it was in this area where the Red Army attacked. And of course, they had superior means. The Japanese were anyway had all kinds of shortages, so that it was no problem. The Red Army did overrun the Japanese in Manchuria and in Korea. Then, one day after the Russian attack, came then Nagasaki. That is the second American bomb on August 9th. And it is after this second bomb was dropped that a Japanese reaction came, because the Japanese ignored that there were no more bombs, but they were concerned that this would mean the ultimate destruction of all Japanese major cities. And so the Japanese emperor, who had so far remained silent, he now all of us, and he was like an icon, he was like a living god, venerated by the Japanese people and particularly by his soldiers. It was absolutely a shock when the emperor addressed himself directly to the Japanese people and to the Japanese army, saying that they were willing to surrender, that it was for the sake of saving the people and the country that Japan offered its surrender. And that was August 15th. That is just 1 week after the Russians had entered the war. Now, the formal signing of the Japanese surrender did take place only on September 2nd on the Tokyo Bay, where the American battleship Missouri, where MacArthur was waiting for the Japanese envoys, and where the Japanese general came to sign the official surrender of Japan. That was the end of the war in the Far East. But of course, that was not what we had been interested in the first place. We nonetheless have to mention that in this war against Japan, the brunt of the war was carried out by was carried by the United States Army, the U.S. naval, essentially naval forces and Marines were those who fought against Japan. The British had a minor share of the fighting going on, particularly the British armed forces stationed in India and in Burma, which was also a British colony in those days. Those of you who have seen, I do not know whether this film is still popular with Americans, The Bridge on the River Kwai. You might have seen this movie with Alec Guinness in one of the main roles. That is a reflection of the war in which the British were involved. The other war, let's say, involved country was China. There is no doubt that the Chinese people suffered a lot as a consequence of the Japanese aggression. China lost millions of not only soldiers but also of civilians as a consequence of these 8 long years of war with Japan. When the war was over, the northern part of China was occupied by Mao's communist forces, which were supplied with weapons and material by the Red Army, whereas the central and southern part was liberated not by American forces but by the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. So in other words, the war in the Far East did last much longer, created scars and wounds which have not meanwhile healed. On the contrary, Japan would not admit to the war crimes which were committed by its army. They did not have SS forces, but the Japanese army did not behave following the rules of international warfare in China. Some of the worst crimes were committed. I already mentioned that to you. And the Japanese had also their manglers. They had also their special doctors which made tests at the expense of the Chinese population. You know also that one of the still, I would say, difficult problems of the heritage of this war was the fate of more than 200,000 women, Chinese, Korean, and others, whom the Japanese forced to serve in Japanese brothels, army brothels. Not to mention the attitude of the Japanese army, which committed the worst crimes against the civilian and even against the military in China. The famous incident, the rape of Nanking, has entered history and is still unresolved because no Japanese government has taken the responsibility for these crimes. On the contrary, all kinds of attempts were made to minimize what had happened and to present this as minor incidents. They were not minor incidents. These were genocides. Yes?
Did this war end at the same time that they surrendered to the United States?
Yes,
It was all
that was the end. Well, with the Japanese surrendering, you know, there were no other. This was the end of the war in the Far East. But let's come back now. And by the way, I think I might have mentioned, we know the role played by this Nazi German Oskar Schindler in during the 2 last years of the war, when he ultimately ended up saving more than 1,000 Jewish workers from certain death. There was another Nazi by the name of Rabe, who was a businessman in Nanking, that is in China. And his intervention helped to save the lives of hundreds, and maybe even more, of women and girls from persecution, from mistreatment by the Japanese soldiers. And he was equally recognized by the Chinese, later on communist governments, but of course did not get the same kind of reputation because apparently a movie has been made. But of course it was not, he did not have a Spielberg to make the movie, and so that he is not that well known. But it is the same as the pharmacist of the ghetto of Krakow. Despite the horrors, or in the midst of horrors committed, as they are always committed, but on a scale never reached before in World War II, you have examples of outstanding humanitarian activities and commitments on the part of individuals like Schindler, like Rabe, like this Polish nurse by the name, I think Sandler was her name, and Pankiewicz was the name of the pharmacist. So that, fortunately, in the midst of horror, there are also some limited but nonetheless real lights, which is a proof that elementary human feelings and elementary qualities of humanity and of humanism was not totally lost. This being said, let's return now to the European stage and see how World War II evolved. First of all, only from the perspective of the military political goal, conquest of living space. Remember what we had mentioned about World War I. World War I had started as a clash of fierce, overexcited nationalisms in Europe and had ended allegedly with the victory of democracy after the US intervention and after the US president practically at the end of the war forced in those Eastern European countries the establishment of democratic regimes which did not survive. When we look now on World War II, World War II, contrary to World War I, was essentially, and I would say only, the consequence of one man's goals. In World War I, you could say every country, or most countries, had a certain share of responsibility for the outbreak of the war. The greater responsibility was on the German side. But there was also responsibility on the French side, on the Austrian, on the Russian, even to some degree on the British side. But for World War II, this was Hitler's war. Hitler wanted to conquer living space, which was in line with his racialist vision of the reality, of the situation in Europe, and of the attitude and of the situation of the German people. He considered that the German people, in order to unfold its full potential, needed bigger living space than the one which Germany in its frontiers of 1939 offered to the German population. Now, this being the beginning, Hitler's war. Now, of course, it was not the scenario, did not go as he had expected, because after all he lost. But even he did not imagine that he would ultimately have to fight with the French. He imagined that the Italians would neutralize the French. But he certainly did not expect that Great Britain would go to war against him. And that was the fundamental error he made, the fundamental mistake of totally misjudging British foreign policy, not only as far as he was concerned, but even in the past. Because the British would not accept, would not give him a free hand, as he had hoped in Eastern Europe. Now, this meant that he ultimately will be confronted through the evolution of the war, in which he did take the initiative. The initiative from 1939 on until 1943, until the turning of or until 42, let's put it that way. This war essentially was determined by his own decisions to attack Poland. Then afterwards, I do not repeat now what we have seen, to attack France, the Low Countries, and ultimately he was confronted with the necessity, what he considered a necessity, to attack Great Britain, and then ultimately the Soviet Union. So in other words, the scenario evolved quite differently from what he had expected. There was one more important thing which we have to bring out. That is that he attacked much earlier than even his closest military advisors had warned him to, because they considered that by 1939, even though the rearmament program had set in as soon as he was in power, from January 1933 on, but even these 6 years of intensive war preparations were not sufficient to ensure, let's say, against all kinds of unforeseeable mishaps. That is a very important point. So he was betting, he was gambling from the beginning on. He was gambling in that he would get away without the intervention of Great Britain. He was gambling again by using the Blitzkrieg strategy, which was a strategy which was practically calculated on a momentary massive superiority without any cover, without an alternative in case of a setback. In that sense, he was absolutely gambling, and the gamble, of course, did not come out. He lost, and the major loss in this gambling activity was the attack against the Soviet Union, the Battle of Moscow. The Battle of Moscow meant the failure of this, and so from that moment on, the reverses. I mean, it was only a question on when the superiority of the Allied forces would come to play fully. And it took a while. On the Russian side, it took until the Battle of Stalingrad, that is, until 1 year later. On the Far Eastern side, it came even much earlier in the Battle of Midway. But what is also very important as far as Hitler was concerned was the fact that Hitler pretended in his Mein Kampf and in his utterings to his close Nazi buddies, to the businessmen and to the generals, he pretended that he had learned the lesson of World War I. And the lesson of World War I and of his foreign policy, the way he understood it, was that Germany should avoid fighting a war on two fronts, that this would exceed its potential, its means. But that is exactly what he did not avoid. He did not avoid a war on two fronts, because when he attacked the Soviet Union, his ultimate goal, he had on his arms the war against Great Britain. Yes?
Do you think that if Hitler hadn't attacked Russia, that Russia would have attacked Hitler eventually?
I do not think that Russia would have attacked Hitler. But I believe that Hitler sooner or later would have attacked Russia. It was only, he attacked in June 1941, but that was a logical consequence of his whole doctrine of conquest of living space. But coming back to this issue, why did he miscalculate this? Because simply he had misjudged the British attitude, but it was out of unbelievable blindness that he declared war on the United States. Because the question is, would the United States have declared war on Hitler? I assume that they would have done it ultimately. Because after all, they did declare war against Germany in 1917. And Germany in 1917 was not comparable to what Hitler was straight from the beginning on. But it was highly unlikely that the United States would have declared war on Hitler in 1941. But it was Hitler who declared war on the United States. So in other words, it was absolutely, I would say, madness. It was total madness to take up a country which had proven its massive superiority as a great power already in World War I. Now, we ultimately come to the conclusion, why did he do it? Because of his racialist dementia. Because it was really a racialist dementia. He believed, really, it was not only that he pretended for the sake of getting popular support. He believed in his racialist vision of mankind, in the superiority of the German race, in the inferiority of the Latin, the Slav, and particularly, of course, the American people, which was, as I told you, for him, it was nightmarish. This melting pot, this mixture of different people, what made the unique situation of the United States and the power of the United States. For Hitler, that was the ultimate sin, the ultimate proof that the Americans could not be worth very much because of this racialist mixture. So in other words, he fell victim to the absolute crude primitiveness of his own racialist convictions. And that explains his errors, that explains the crimes he committed by launching the war the way he did it, and also his errors of declaring war against the United States. Now, of course, World War II was also different from World War I and from other preceding wars. Because whereas the preceding wars, if we do not get stuck with World War I alone, the preceding wars were wars between countries, were wars for power, for gaining a kind of military or political superiority. World War II was different. World War II was an ideological war. It was not just a war, a confrontation of powers one against the other, of nationalism. It was an ideological war in that it meant, we come back to what I said, it meant a so-called, an allegedly superior race was trying to gain living space at the expense of all the other races which surrounded it. When I use the word racist, I use, of course, a Nazi vocabulary and not a normal, I would say, sober, realistic vocabulary. So in that sense, it was an ideological war, and it also entailed, not as a kind of collateral damage or as a kind of accidental, let's say, negative development. It entailed the extermination of several categories of people, but particularly of one. And this one category of people was the Jewish race.